John Turner is an associate professor of history. John earned his PhD in Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on the interaction of political and religious authority in pre-modern Islamic history. He is particularly interested in the categorization and exclusion of heresy and heretics. His courses range from surveys of the pre-modern and modern periods in the Middle East to country-specific courses, and he covers eras from the foundations of Islam to the current day. So allow me to turn this over to my favorite history department chair, John Turner.
I suppose it helps that I'm currently the only history department chair. Thank you so much for coming today. I think I win for, by word, the longest title, but I didn't actually do a word count. Thank you so much for giving up part of your afternoon to join us today to engage in what we do as scholars, academics, teachers, and faculty here at Colby. And I want to start up by saying that the work we do and the research that we engage pushes the boundaries of knowledge and understanding in profound ways that allow us to see more clearly and understand more deeply and think more creatively in holistic ways about meaning and solutions to problems. Today I stand before you as an expert to talk about something that is very current and present, and I had no idea that the President Obama was going to throw me a curveball on Wednesday night and change large chunks of what I intended to say today. That's the trouble of doing something topical, although I had no idea it was going to be this topical. But putting that aside, as a scholar, I've spent years studying and thinking about the Middle East, and teaching here at Colby pushes me every day to clarify my thinking. Students ask hard questions. They see new things in readings and challenge me to delve more deeply into my research with them to find new answers and better questions. That's always more interesting. Together we explore, we learn, and we grow. And lately, I've had to answer a lot of very hard questions about ISIS. So today, in a cursory fashion, I'm going to engage questions about ISIS, and we're going to do the question words as a way of getting at that. We're going to explore this topic through the questions. But first, I should elaborate a little bit more on what Dean Kletzer introduced me, introduced me with my research, because my research is keenly interested in the Caliphate and is in part focused on the construction and destruction of the medieval Caliphate. So first off, what is a caliph? He was the quasi-religious, almost pope-like, but that's a little controversial for me to say, religious ruler of the empires established in the late 7th and 8th centuries in the Middle East. He more or less became a figurehead by the end of the 9th century and had lost all religious and political power, although he remained largely a figurehead until the Mongols rolled through, killed him in 1258 in Baghdad. Not the same one. And that was the end of the Caliphate. After the 9th century, his importance had waned inexorably, and the Mongols extinguished a barely flickering flame. There was an attempt to revive the title shortly thereafter in Egypt, but it failed. There was another attempt, more concerted, by the Ottomans in the 19th century, but it also failed. Both attempts garnered almost no recognition and were pretty much greeted with, that's a technical historical term for, yeah, not so much. Since the 1970s, though, some very marginal fringe groups have said that their goal is to resurrect the Caliphate and create an Islamic state. They have met with largely the same reaction of, And I should add here that the conception of Islamic State, as they articulate it, is an entirely modern product of decolonization and the rhetoric of the 1950s and 60s, but particularly the 1960s. Now, some more question words. Who are ISIS and what do they want? This is probably very much on your mind. You came probably to hear the answer to those questions. First, a bit of terminology. I refer to them as ISIS and refuse to call them the Islamic State You can call them ISIL if you want. Because if we call them the Islamic State, it is to participate in their PR campaign, and it validates and legitimizes their claim that they are the Islamic State, which they're not. And if you watched President Obama on Wednesday night, he pointed out pretty clearly they are not a state, they aren't. And as they have killed more Muslims and actually more of their own sectarian brethren, the Sunni, than anyone else, their body count is almost disproportionately much higher Sunni, even though they get a lot of credit for killing Shia, they're not so much Islamic either. And it's extremely important for us to differentiate them from the majority populations that surround them or are subjected to them. So who are they? There are about 8,000 to 10,000 of them, fighters, who are specifically ISIS, and we need to also be very careful about not overestimating their size and strength. They have shrewdly organized and have astutely and in highly rational ways used technology and graphic violence to terrorize people into submission to their rule. Their violence is not random, nor are they irrational madmen. That is an important point. Disturbing, disgusting, horrible, yes, undoubtedly so. But we cannot dismiss their actions as atavistic bloodthirst, as one of the recent stories in the New York Times would have it. Okay, so why do they do such vile things, and what do they want? One, ISIS is trying to draw us, the United States, into a ground war that forces us to appear to be propping up both Assad in Syria and a divisively sectarian regime in Baghdad to the benefit of Iran, thereby alienating the areas with majority Sunni populations into supporting or at least acquiescing to ISIS. The execution videos were designed to make us mad. They were designed to provoke us into ill-considered action, a knee-jerk response. A corollary aim is that once we've been drawn into a ground war, we will spend so much money, time, effort, blood, that what happened to the Soviets in the 1980s in Afghanistan will happen to us. The goal is to bleed us dry, to break our economy and force us into collapse. But importantly, we're a side note on their way to something else. Their ultimate goal is to overthrow the Saudis, take Mecca and Medina, then Jerusalem, while picking up Damascus and Baghdad on the way. This movement has nothing to do with the medieval period or the medieval caliphate, and that's a very important point. They are decidedly modern and using modern methods. They glossed over their high school history textbooks, did not take a college class. They borrowed some phrases and symbols, but are very much a product of post-2003 Iraq and post-2011 Syria. And the power vacuums created as formerly powerful states abandon whole regions of their territory. ISIS borrows the symbols of the Abbasid Caliphate of the 9th century. Those are my people. Those are the ones I work on. And they do so in an effort to claim legitimacy for themselves, but at the same time, they flout, ignore, and grossly violate 1,000 years' worth of Islamic jurisprudence. The entire theory and corpus of Islamic law, they've chucked out the window. It's thoroughly modern. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the so-called Caliph Ibrahim, wears the trappings of a scholar and tries to look the part of one, but he is not. He claims descent from Prophet Muhammad, not so much. In any case, we can spend a lot of time talking in the Q&A about his name, because his name is, the names that he chooses to use, are packed with historical allusions, or illusions, actually. Now, where have they gotten the money and resources that have made them so successful? The next question we need to address. Well, initially, when there were overly optimistic predictions of the fall of Assad, money and weapons were poured into Syria. Just tip the bucket in, very little control over who got what and how those resources were distributed. And ISIS was able to get a significant chunk of that. There were also many rebels who we had initially identified as moderate, who then took the weapons and money and defected and joined ISIS. So you will find American military hardware in the hands of ISIS that they acquired not from the Iraqi army when they abandoned their weapons, but from the distribution of weapons in Syria. Now, ISIS is also, you've read the news, you've seen, they've also received money paid in ransoms, but that's not where the bulk of their resources come from. By far, the bulk comes from oil, selling oil. They sell oil, we buy oil. We need oil. They get money from that. They also have robbed a number of banks, the most significant one in Mosul, and through their bank robbery activities, they've managed to acquire about $400 million in cash, US dollars. They have dollars. Now, they've also strategically sought to control water, electricity, and food supplies so as to make the subject populations dependent on them for basic survival. You rebel, you raise a dissonant word, you're cut off, and you die. That's a pretty basic incentive. They have also taken advantage of the disarray of the Sunni opposition, and the Iraqi government has been particularly tone deaf to Sunni concerns. And so the convergence of all these factors allows them to grow and at least get the tacit non-revolt of the populations that they're ruling over, because it's extremely difficult to revolt. And as an important side note, and this is really important, despite what you hear repeatedly in the media, the Shia-Sunni split of the 7th century has nothing to do with this. This is not at play at all. That is a misrepresentation of history. What we are seeing is a competition for resources that is a modern phenomenon, partially rooted in this, and the construction of the Iraqi state in the 1920s, but reinforced by the policies of Saddam Hussein and made profoundly worse by the 2003 invasion. Saddam allocated resources in order to create a power base that, A, was dependent on him, and by the way, the sanctions of the 1990s reinforced his power because he was the only conduit for any resources. And B, the population became, the constituency that he was having beholden to him, became fearful of what would happen to them were he to fall. We reversed that paradigm by installing a regime with a narrowly defined power base that explicitly excluded those who had been tied to Saddam's regime, confirming their worst fears. And in the process, this happened. This is ethnic cleansing. This is a snapshot of ethnic cleansing in Baghdad that took place throughout the country. The severing of contact, the breaking of trust between communities as they fought over resources and pushed each other to the margins, and the Shia became dominant in Baghdad. In Syria, conditions are different, but a similar vacuum of power opened up in which the Assad regime and its supporters, which, despite the wishful thinking inside the Beltway, is still about half the population. They still have the loyalty and support of about half the population. They become in a position of deeply fearing what will happen to them if Assad were to fall, reinforcing their tie to the regime, because they look at what happened in Syria and they say, wow, we don't want that. And I don't have enough time to go into great detail, but I wanted to do today was to give a sense of why understanding the history of the region, recognizing the abuse of history, and being empowered by that knowledge allows us to make more deeply informed decisions. Every day, each of us, as faculty here at Colby, are engaging our students in asking hard questions, pushing the boundaries, exploring new vistas of knowledge that open up as a result of the shared journey. What we do as scholars, as faculty, is deeply connected to and informed by what we do as teachers. That our mission and our role as intellects, public scholars, public intellectuals is tied deeply to what we do as researchers and what we do as teachers. That they are deeply connected and tied to each other. And that is what I wanted to mainly convey today. And I will end there. And thank you so much for your time. And I hope that you have a lovely weekend and you enjoy all of the festivities and my little depression talk doesn't bring you down too far.
for John. Please raise your hand, and we'll get you a microphone, and we'll ask you to stand when you ask your question. Okay, Ruth has something from the feed.
I do. This is a question from an alum from the class of 1976. Can you recommend a really good general book for a college-age student on the origins of Islam and the history of the Islamic countries?
Oh, there are a number of good places to start. If you want to learn about Iraq, there's a History of Iraq by Phoebe Marr, which is a pretty decent place to start. If you want to learn about Islam, Karen Armstrong does a really good biography of Muhammad that is worthwhile engaging. If you are interested in learning about the Quran, I would say the first place you should go is reading a book by Michael Cook called A Very Short Introduction to the Quran. I think it's Oxford University Press. Those are 3 pretty good places to start.
Professor Turner, is there a way in which you can visualize the U.S. possibly playing a pivotal role in this conflict, not militarily, but diplomatically, in the sense of possibly uniting other countries in the Middle East to work together against this problem that is crossing international borders?
There are a couple things that go along with that I think are very important. There really isn't a military solution to ISIS. One of the lessons that we have learned over the years that hasn't quite been internalized in DC yet, inside Beltway, is that air power can only do so much. You can bomb the fool out of somebody, but usually if they know the aircraft is coming, they leave, and then they come back after you're done bombing. Without infantry, without people backing up, air power is a tactical battlefield tool that you use to open space up for infantry to take and hold territory. That is a proposition that's not going to fly with the American public. We will need allies on the ground inside of the regional countries that will support and fulfill that infantry role. And that is a political solution that's going to have to be a diplomatic one worked out with all of the surrounding countries. An interesting corollary and a danger that I see, that one that's very real for us, is that if we start doing airstrikes in Syria, which is part of what the president announced on Wednesday, is that's on the table. If we start doing that, we've now legitimized and given a precedent for Putin to use airstrikes to intervene in Ukraine. And that's a very serious consequence. And that is one that is going to take some very difficult diplomatic heavy lifting to get around. And that means the political solution and the diplomatic solution are really the only long-term way out. And as a reminder, terrorism is a tactic. It's a tactic. You cannot stamp out the tactic. You must address the reasons why people use that tactic.
What do you think about what's going on in Turkey right now? And I think a little bit back to, say, Kemal Ataturk, the overthrow of the Ottoman Empire, the liberation of women, and the creation of a secular state, juxtaposed with this, which is the complete opposite. And could there be a charismatic individual or a charismatic movement that could put up a plausible front as a alternative to the youth to ISIS?
It is possible. One of the things that made Ataturk so successful was the complete social disruption of World War I that opened up space for a charismatic leader like him and like-minded folks to create that secular state and the impetus towards secular state in Turkey. One of the interesting things you note in the last 10, 20 years in Turkey is the normalization, particularly in the last 5 years, of public religious practice and the almost making peace between the secular arms of the state and the Islamists like Erdogan. And that there has been a rapprochement that is more or less mainlined and made into a political party and a political force in the discourse. Someone like Erdogan, who would have 20 years ago, 30 years ago, been thrown in prison. That model has been deeply attracted to other countries. They talked about doing it in Egypt after the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak. but there wasn't a similar figure who was able to rise up and gather enough support to make that work. Whether that could happen in Iraq and Syria is unclear because nobody appears to be on the radar at this point. The Syrian forces, the opposition, are in such disarray, and it's largely a fiction, the Free Syria Army, and the idea that there are moderate forces to whom we could give weapons. That's mostly a Beltway fiction.
Hi, Professor. I just had a question about the borders of the Middle East.
Yes.
Now that you have, like, you have the conflict in Syria, and you have pretty much any lack of government in Libya, and now you have the emergence of ISIL in Iraq. I was just wondering if you saw, like, do you see the map of the Middle East being preserved, or do you see realignment of the borders that were made in the 1920s?
This is something that comes up periodically about what the effects of the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the middle of World War I between the French and the British, more or less, about how to divide up the Ottoman Empire and the boundaries that got drawn as a result of this agreement. The problem with the redivision is that the nation-state ideal is so strongly embedded in the international conceptions of legitimacy and sovereignty that it is extremely hard to break free of. And if you are going to break free of it, you have to do so in very specific ways that I don't see happening. And the biggest problem is going to be this whole northeast corner of Syria, that northern part of Iraq, the entire southeast of Turkey over in that corner, and the northwest part of Iran that is mostly Kurdish. But it's actually not entirely Kurdish, and there's lots of mixed ethnic populations in those areas. And to create Kurdistan out of those areas, one, we'd have to carve off 25% of our NATO ally, Turkey, to do it. That is unlikely to happen. And there would have to be massive ethnic cleansing to make it take hold. And in order for the boundaries to be redrawn, you would have to have a collapse of the surrounding countries. Iran would have to collapse, Turkey would have to collapse, Syria and Iraq with it, although arguably Syria and Iraq are pretty close to collapse anyway. The likelihood of Turkey tolerating 25% of their population and landmass being carved off, they fought really hard in the 1920s to make sure that did not happen. I don't see it happening.
We had a question up here. Can we get a mic, please? Thank you.
Hi, I'm interested in the connections between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I've heard that ISIS is a rejected offshoot of Al-Qaeda, but I'm not sure how that works. Are they competing? Are they connected? Or?
The thing about Al-Qaeda that's important for us to remember is it's actually very, very small. It really operates as a franchisor, and that the various groups around the country are franchising much like a fast food chain, that you get the name and you get some of the cachet that goes with it. Now, there's very few actual links between Ayman al-Zawahiri and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or the stuff in North Africa and Libya, or even Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. ISIS was rejected by Ayman al-Zawahiri for being too brutal, too alienating, and too violent, which is pretty heavy statement. It's kind of like the Rolling Stones saying to Brian Jones, sorry, you're just too out there. Sorry, there are certain people who are of a certain age who will get that. The younger won't. But the point that I'm making is that the connection between, say, Jabhat al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda are very weak at best. And the connection between ISIS and Al-Qaeda is ISIS is now positioning itself as a direct competitor to superseding Al-Qaeda. That they are arguing that Al-Qaeda was a lot of rhetoric, and they're actually doing it, is what they're saying. That's why they want us to call them the Islamic State, instead of something like ISIS. And I actually think it's delicious that you call them Isis, which is the name of an ancient Egyptian goddess, which they would not.
Question way in the back.
Hi, Professor Turner. Thank you for your presentation. I just have two quick questions. You've heard a lot about the Westerners joining the ISIS movement, especially from the video of the beheading, the possible British citizen. Could you comment briefly about if that's different from Westerners moving towards joining the Al-Qaeda movement, and also touch on the fact that ISIS is using digital media in a new way to spread their message? Thank you.
In terms of recruitment, it's making a lot of news that there are Westerners, but if you think about the percentages, it's really quite low. The number of Westerners who've gone over and joined up, it's actually a fairly rare phenomenon. And if we're concerned about that, what we need to be doing is reaching out to Islamic communities, Muslims in wherever they may be, and seeing ways to have conversations about alleviating grievances that might drive younger people to seek this path. And one of the things that's most interesting is in the studies that have been done of the people who have gone to join is they're mostly not religious. They mostly grew up in non-religious environments, and they feel alienated and disconnected, and this is a way for them to feel part of something bigger than themselves. And so if we start to address those kinds of concerns and start to work with and in cooperation with Muslim communities to make them feel less under siege, then that is a much better counter to people joining Al-Qaeda or joining up with ISIS.
Okay, I think we can sneak in one more question.
So suppose that ISIS is like degraded to the threat level of that Al-Qaeda was in Iraq before the Syrian civil war. Where do you see the future of Iraq heading in terms of like government and the whole cabinet?
Well, that's tricky. If we have a replay of Maliki and the previous prime ministership and regime, then everything is going to explode. You think it's bad now? Hold on. If the new government can find a way to not be so tone deaf to Sunni concerns, bring Sunnis into their administration, and start to open lines of dialogue to those communities, then there is hope for reconstituting an actual government that controls all of the territory that is deemed sovereign in Iraq. That's kind of iffy. It's really quite interesting that the Minister of Interior and the Minister of War have not been named, and those are the two most controversial positions. And if they were to appoint Sunnis to them, if I were to give them advice, and if I could give them advice, I would say, you need to put Sunni people into those positions, and you need to work closely with them and coordinate with them so that the Sunni communities that are under occupation by ISIS will start to say, hey, the Iraqi government is not a Shi'i government that's coming to get us. And that's actually the way out of this, is the creation of a sense that the Shia in Iran and the Shia in Syria and the Shia in Iraq are trying to create one big Shia state that will dominate and squish all the Sunnis and push them out. And if we can get to the point where people stop thinking that that's what's coming, then there is an option for a mediated solution. And that's a lot of ifs. That's a lot of ifs.
John, thank you very much.